Hi, I'm Sidney Altman. I'm affiliated with Yale University, and I have the pleasure today of speaking with Matthew Meselson, who is at Harvard University and one of this year's Lasker Prize awardees. I will start by asking Matt about his education. How is it that you wound up going to the University of Chicago, although you're a Southern California person?
Well, I grew up during the war, that is the Second World War, and I think, although it was very far away, it was the focus of our attention, even as young people, and it seemed the wrong thing to do to just enjoy oneself in the summer. Many of us went to summer school and took jobs. I had a job at a vitamin factory, and I went to summer school, and as a result of that, I accumulated all the necessary credits to be graduated from high school. And one fall, I went to the registrar at my high school expecting to be given a diploma, and she said, no, in California, one must have 3 full years of physical education in order to get a diploma. And I wanted to get started with my college education. These were serious times. And so she said, well, you could just take the courses you like best over again, as though they were like desserts that you'd want more. It seemed such a strange idea to me. Up to then, I thought that my elders for sure knew best, and it was a shock to realize suddenly that the system didn't know best. And I knew that my body would grow anyway. It was my mind that was supposed to get something out of education. So I started asking people, what can I do? I'm stuck. I can't get a diploma. How can I get to college? And I heard that there was a place, the University of Chicago, which had instituted a system on the thought that the last couple of years in high school for a lot of people weren't very usefully spent anyway. And they actually wanted people who had not finished high school. And so I went there. I was expecting to study chemistry, but I learned when I got there that they had abolished the bachelor's degree in chemistry. And in all of the specialized subjects, they still had advanced degrees. Of course, it was a great school. But undergraduates all took liberal arts. So without knowing what I was getting into, I got a little bit of a smattering of a classical education. We read great works.
Great books.
Great works.
Okay. How do you think your view of education at that time, or the general view, has changed for today's young student? What would a student expect today from a college education that you may or may not have had at the University of Chicago?
Well, I think the university I know most about, of course, is Harvard, because that's where I am. I'm not a specialist in education, so I can talk only about Harvard. At Harvard, there's an enormous variety of courses from which students may choose with considerable freedom. And students seem to value that. Even when applying for colleges, I know with my own children, have sought out places that accord a great deal of freedom. This is in a way a paradox, because it's assuming that a student already knows what it is he should be knowing. And that's not necessarily true. It's a bit circular, in fact. So, for example, I think there are some fundamental things that it would be good for everybody to know, so there would be a commonality of knowledge, some base that people had in common. But that's pretty much shattered by the modern system of a huge number of electives. I've proposed to a succession of deans at Harvard to institute a different system that would be voluntary. Students wouldn't be required to do it, but they could enroll in a special program in which the courses were, in a sense, interdigitated. The faculty would coordinate the different course offerings, and they would be historically based. They would try to show people how we got where we are. And it would require also that they take their meals together, because they would all be reading the same works at the same time, and therefore at mealtime they would discuss them. Whereas now, at any given table in one of the residence halls at Harvard, seldom do you find a small group of people, all of whom have anything in common to talk about except sports and politics and current events and social things. And so their living together doesn't contribute nearly as much to their education as it could.
Well, I understand the arguments you made, and I have various experiences of mine which can...
You were a dean.
Well, that's true, I was, and I was in charge of a curriculum at Yale. But we won't get into that at the moment. I will say that several years ago, I was interviewing a son of a friend of mine who wanted to go to university, and he asked me the direct question, why should I pay any attention to you in terms of what courses I should take? Well, I guess I maybe missed my calling as a professor, but anyway. You're talking about a general mode of education, which I happen to agree with, but what about the people in the sciences? Surely there must be common ground in the sciences, which we must all undertake to pursue knowledge in the appropriate way.
Yes, but a common knowledge of science doesn't equip you to be a citizen of a democracy. It doesn't give you any fundamental understanding of how we got to where we are, what struggles our species has gone through to achieve the degree of freedom that does exist in some places or in some subcultures. So that just knowing chemistry and physics is not equipment for being a citizen. It's a different thing. And ultimately, the nature of the citizenry is going to determine the environment for everybody in a democracy.
Once again, I agree with you, but let's say somebody chooses science as a topic to pursue. Is their education going to be any different today from yours was? Or what was advantageous about your education that made it such a rewarding career in the end?
Well, I had to begin all over again as a freshman at Caltech, having gone through a bachelor's degree program in liberal arts at Chicago. So my scientific education was quite the same, I think, as scientific educations are today. I took the usual courses in calculus and physics and chemistry, not much biology until later. So I don't know that there is that much difference in science education. The high schools are critically important in this, in that if they did their job, when I went to high school in California, it was, if not the highest rated high school system and public school system in the country, certainly near the top. And now it's very near the bottom. And that, of course, is because of people who don't want to pay real estate tax to support our schools. We have a very peculiar system in this country where the schools are supported by real estate tax from essentially small subunits of our country, so that if it's a poor subunit, the schools are poor because that's where their income comes from. And if it's a rich subunit, the schools are wealthy. And this creates almost inborn inequalities in educational opportunity for people because of this strange way in which we finance our public education. I don't know of any other country that does it on the basis of small units such as counties or cities.
Well, let's consider that for a while. I know that in conversation with you, you told me that you had a very important chemistry teacher in high school. I had some excellent teachers too, and my general feeling is at that time, people who taught specialized subjects in high school were educated in those subjects, which I'm afraid does not seem to be the case anymore. So I think there has to be not only a change in funding, but also a change in what we expect from our high school teachers. But that's just my personal comment.
Of course, and of course how well we regard them, what respect we pay to them, so that people who think highly of themselves will go into that field.
Right, exactly.
I was very lucky too in the timing in which I got into science. It was just when the DNA structure was discovered, and it was a kind of roadmap of what to do. Most molecules, if you look at a protein molecule or a lipid molecule or a carbohydrate molecule, it doesn't tell you what it does. We're beginning to learn how to look at a protein and say, well, probably it's a hydrolase. You can do a little bit, but DNA was totally different. You look at DNA, and in a way, it speaks to you. It says, here I am, I have two chains, and they're complementary to each other. Obviously, that's how I replicate. Go out and show it. It says to you, I have a sequence of nucleotides that can be any sequence and will still have the same acceptable, stable structure. Therefore, this can encode information. Go out and show that's really how the information is encoded. It has two chains, so that if you damage one, you could recover the information from the other, which is still intact. So there's a suggestion in the structure for how DNA repairs its own mistakes. Go out in the laboratory and show that how that's done. DNA can recognize other nucleotides like it because of the base pairing rules. So you look at the DNA molecule and you say, to get the information out, it must take some other nucleotide to be able to recognize it. And okay, turned out in fact, that's exactly the way Francis Crick looked at it and predicted the adapter molecule. So DNA was a remarkable molecule in that not only did it tell you everything in a sense, it didn't quite tell you, it hinted it, it whispered it, a little bit above a whisper, but below a shout. And then the other thing about it was, it wasn't a molecule that does a job like a carbohydrate or a protein. It's the very center, the heart of life. What is life? It means something that can, first of all, reproduce itself, but it must also be something that can change, so that then changed forms can be the stuff of which evolution happens. And so DNA can mutate. You can change one nucleotide to another. The third thing you need to have a living system, it needs to be able to express itself in some way, create its own environment, build stuff around it, cells, more complicated things like us. And DNA does that too, because it carries the information which then can be transcribed and translated into things around it, so that it is the secret of life in a way. And when I got beginning into science, there wasn't the faintest clue how these things could happen. People were still talking. There was this famous book by Erwin Schrödinger, a physicist, one of the founders of quantum mechanics. And many people were deeply impressed by it. I read it as a young chemist and thought it was bunk, because all he ended up saying was that if the gene or the chromosomes were made up of a lot of loose molecules, heat motion would disrupt their structure. That wouldn't be stable enough to represent the genetic information. So the chromosome, or at least chunks of it, must be based on covalent bonds. Well, yeah, what else? I mean, totally obvious. He made it sound fancy by saying covalent bonds exist because of quantum mechanics, Heitler-London forces.
No, I agree with you about your opinion of Schrödinger's book.
So I read that thinking I'm going to find the answer, and it wasn't there. Well, and the young person didn't know what to do till the DNA structure was available.
Well, I remember Schrödinger talking about crystals and the order of crystals, but it didn't make any sense to me either.
No, it didn't.
Now, I had a slightly different tack in my own education, and when I was in graduate school, I read the famous Brenner-Crick paper on the triplet nature of the code, and I looked at that and I wondered how they could have found out what they actually said they found out, and that was a complete mystery to me. And I read that paper and did a lot to convince me to change fields. Now we're talking about education a little bit. You talked about undergraduate education, and then one goes on to graduate school, let's say, and studies after that. You were very fortunate as a graduate student to engage in an absolutely wonderful experiment, the Meselson-Stahl experiment, as it's called. And I think that you probably knew where to go after that. But today, our field has expanded rapidly because of its own success.